Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website. I would ask everyone here in-house as we prepare to begin to make that final courtesy check that cell phones have been turned off. It is always appreciated. And, of course, we will post the program shortly on our Heritage homepage for everyone's future reference. Our Internet viewers are always welcome to send their questions or comments, simply emailing us at speaker@heritage.org. Hosting our program today is James Phillips, who serves as our Senior Research Fellow for Middle Eastern Affairs in the Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign and National Security Policy. He is a veteran foreign policy specialist who has written widely on Middle Eastern affairs and international terrorism since 1978. He is a former research fellow at the Congressional Research Service and a former joint doctoral research fellow at the East-West Center. His primary research for us concerns Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Persian Gulf security issues, and Middle Eastern terrorism. Since 9/11, he has written extensively on the global war against terror and the implications it has for all of our U.S. policy in the Middle East. He has also testified before Congress on Iranian terrorism, the Iranian nuclear standoff, and other Middle Eastern issues. He is a member, too, of the Board of Editors of Middle East Quarterly. Please join me in welcoming James Phillips. Jim?
Thanks, John. And thank you for coming on a very nice day, finally a nice day in Washington. Last week, Iranian negotiators met with diplomats from the U.S. and 5 other powers to work on a deal on the Iranian nuclear issue. And this nuclear issue has dominated news on Iran for many years now, in part because it's a game changer in the very volatile Middle East region. It's a severe threat to the U.S. It's an existential threat to Israel, and a major challenge to Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and other of Iran's neighbors that find themselves under the growing shadow of Iranian power. While the nuclear issue deserves all the attention it can get, too often I think it eclipses other important issues such as human rights and terrorism, and part of the reason for bringing this panel today is to keep an equal focus on all 3 of those, and we're very fortunate to have 3 leading experts to address all of these issues. Our first speaker is Dr. Ken Katzman. He's a specialist in Middle Eastern affairs at the Congressional Research Service. In that capacity, he serves as a senior Middle East analyst for the U.S. Congress, with special emphasis on Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, and the Persian Gulf. He provides reports and briefings to members of Congress and their staffs on U.S. policies on these countries and issues, and provides analysis of related legislative proposals. He's participated in several congressional delegations to the region and given many official presentations and briefings at conference and meetings throughout Europe, Asia, and the Islamic world. He's written numerous articles on various outside publications, and I think most notably a book entitled The Warriors of Islam, Iran's Revolutionary Guard, which was the subject of his PhD thesis. He's testified before various congressional committees on Iran, Iraq, and Afghanistan. He's twice been assigned to work closely on the staff of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And before coming to CRS, he was an analyst at the CIA, where he prepared written reports on U.S. Middle East policymakers on leadership dynamics in Iran, Iraq, and the Persian Gulf states. Ken?
Thank you, Jim. And thank you to Heritage for inviting me again. It's good to be back. My presentation will be in English, if that's okay. I've been asked to speak mainly on where we stand as far as the nuclear negotiations go. And I will try to, not being a proliferation expert, not being a scientist, even though I was pre-med in college, so I understand physics and stuff like that, but still, I'm not a proliferation expert, but I'll try to summarize where we are. So the 3rd round of talks as you may remember, in November, there was reached an interim agreement, 6-month duration, which is sort of a freeze, Basically, Iran's program is not advancing anymore for 6 months. It's renewable if there's, and so we had the interim agreement, and then that provides for talks on a permanent solution, a sort of a final status solution. So the interim agreement is January 20th to July 20th. It is extendable if no agreement is reached. The third round of talks on a comprehensive settlement, a final settlement, just wrapped up on April 9th, so I guess it was 1 week ago. I would say that the third round, this follows an earlier round in February where there was agreement on a work plan for the final status talks and agenda, and then there was a round in March, and then in early April. So the April 9th round concluded. I would say on a note of relative optimism, there are comments from all sides that feels that the outstanding gaps are perhaps soluble. I would say the optimism seems to have grown somewhat since these talks started. No one says that we're close to an agreement, but no one is ruling it out. The talks are between Iran and the so-called P5+1, the permanent five of the UN Security Council plus Germany, and the European Union Chief Foreign Policy Negotiator, Baroness Catherine Ashton, is sort of the host and convener, so she gives out the statements. At the end of the April 9th round, she said, you know, there is still hard work to do, intensive work required, but and that the next round, which starts May 13th, so a little less than a month from now, would actually proceed to now starting to try to narrow the gaps. The first two rounds were understanding what are the differences, and now they know what the gaps are in the positions, and now the issue is to start trying to negotiate a bridging of the differences. They are expected to begin actually exchanging drafts at the next round. So I'm not sure who, maybe it's us, maybe it's somebody, maybe the French or somebody will have a draft of an agreement, and then the process of amending it and narrowing, getting rid of what's in brackets that's not been agreed to will start. I would say the issue surrounding the UN ambassador, Mr. Abu Talibi, did not really affect the last round. It's a sort of a segregated issue a bit. I would say the consensus is that the Ukraine crisis did not really disrupt the talks either, and that the U.S. and Russia continue to work very well together in these, for this purpose at least. So just briefly, let me discuss. So when we're talking about narrowing the gaps, okay, so what are the gaps? What are really the outstanding issues and yet to be agreed? And clearly I would say uranium enrichment as a broad category is the biggest single difference right now. There's differences among, you know, basically Iran has about 18,000 installed centrifuges right now, enriching uranium. Reports are the U.S. wants to perhaps agree to a final settlement that would allow Iran to run maybe 3,000 or 4,000 as sort of a symbolic uranium enrichment capability that would allow us enough time, if Iran were to start diverting this nuclear material, we would be able to discover it. We would have a lot of lead time to pursue other options, which I won't specify, but we can imagine what those would be. So far, Iran has not been accused, really, of diverting any nuclear material, but this is, you know, the issue is to make sure they could not do that without being discovered with a big lead time. So, how many centrifuges they would be allowed to run? Some of our partners would like to get down to 0 centrifuges running at the end, and I believe the U.S. administration view is that, and the Joint Plan of Action, the interim agreement does say that there is that, you know, Iran may be enriching uranium as part of a final settlement. So I think clearly the administration is not going to try necessarily to get Iran to zero, recognizing that Iran is steadfast on not completely dismantling its enrichment capability. But the view is that maybe 3,000, 4,000 could be something we could live with. Then subordinately, the issue is, okay, what's done with the product? If they are still enriching at the end, what's done? Can they still stockpile enriched uranium? Would it be reprocessed somewhere else? Could they make new centrifuges that run faster? Would they be allowed to do that? Would they be allowed to install them? So these are some of the issues. The Fordo site near Qom that I'm sure you're familiar with, it's a hardened site. The U.S., the international position is that that should be closed. There could be some wiggle room to maybe re-engineer it into something else. I don't know, but that's an issue that's out there. Another major issue is the issue of plutonium production. As you know, enriching uranium is one way to produce the fissile material for a nuclear weapon. Producing plutonium is another way. So Iran is building this heavy water reactor at Arak, the city of Arak, which, if it's complete, it's not complete yet, they're building it, they would be able to produce plutonium. And so the issue, the United States and its partners want to, well, I think, the issue is let's close it. And the Iranians' view is we don't want to dismantle anything, so there seems to be some possible agreement around the idea of re-engineering it into a light water reactor, which would not produce plutonium, or re-engineering it for some other purpose. Another broad category is what possible military dimension. As you know, Iran has been accused of doing some research on a nuclear explosive device. So for a nuclear weapon, you need the fissile material, but you also need a detonation mechanism. And Iran was accused by the IAEA of having done some research into a nuclear explosive device. So these questions have to be cleared up. Iran has to provide complete access to the facilities where this may have been going on. There were reports Iran may have even done some test detonations at a facility called Parchin. Iran refuses really to allow that to be re-inspected. It is not a declared nuclear facility. It is a military facility. And Iran's view is under our agreement with our safeguards agreement with the IAEA, we're not required to show you or give you access to military facilities. We're only allowed to give you, supposed to give you access to declared nuclear facilities. So that's an issue that the IAEA is working on separately to the comprehensive talks. There's a big gap surrounding ballistic missiles. The interim agreement says at the end, Iran must satisfy all Security Council resolutions. One of the resolutions demands that Iran not build or develop any nuclear-capable ballistic missiles. Iran thus far has really refused to discuss the ballistic missile issue in the final status talks. Their view is, it's not really part of the nuclear discussions. I wouldn't say they refused to discuss, but they have not really given apparently any ground on this issue till now. Monitoring, obviously any agreement that's reached has to be extensively, intrusively monitored. There are definitely some opinions that the Supreme Leader, Sayyid Ali Khamenei, might not allow, very intrusive monitoring, so that all has to be worked out. And then there's the issue of, okay, this is an exchange. Iran is giving up its nuclear ability basically to make a nuclear weapon, so what does Iran get? Well, the issue is they get sanctions relief if we have a deal. So then the issue is, and this is part of the negotiations, do they get sanctions relief all at once, or is it come in stages? The U.S. view is it should be stepwise, that as Iran dismantles or rolls back its program, that sanctions relief are stepwise. The agreement so far has been that nuclear-related sanctions would be lifted. Well, how do you necessarily define nuclear-related sanctions? Basically the sanctions on Iran's oil exports right now are they have nothing to do necessarily with anything nuclear, but they are nuclear related because they were put in place to force Iran to negotiate this agreement. So those are nuclear related sanctions. You have sanctions that have been imposed because of Iran's support of terrorism. But some of those get into issues of Iranian revenue, Iranian oil exports, etc. So would those be lifted too, or not? So the extent of sanctions relief is to be negotiated. There are also human rights sanctions that have been put in place. Now, those are not nuclear related, but still they get into some issues that some might say those are nuclear related. And some Iranians might say, well, those are related to, they were put in place because of our nuclear program anyway, so we want them lifted too. So these are some issues that could come up. And then there's the issue of duration. Iran wants any final agreement to only last, maybe 5 years, and then they would go maybe scot-free. The U.S. view is this should be indefinite. We want to make sure you don't have a capability for a nuclear weapon, and we don't want to have to worry about it 5 years from now. So that also is to be negotiated. So I think this gives a sense of where we are right now.
Okay, thanks, Ken. Our next speaker is Ali Alfona. Ali is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and he's a top expert on Iran and the inner workings of the Iranian regime. Ali came to FDD from the American Enterprise Institute, where he worked as a resident fellow specializing on civil-military relations in Iran and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. He is the originator of the thesis that the Islamic Republic is transforming into a military dictatorship, which he first came up with back in 2005, and now is very widely accepted in many corners. Ali also is the author of Iran Unveiled, How the Revolutionary Guard is Transforming Iran from Theocracy into Military Dictatorship, which was published last year. He's also the author of the definitive series of articles on Major General Qasem Soleimani, commander of the Quds Force, the Revolutionary Guard's extraterritorial operational branch. Mr. Alfona grew up in Tehran, but moved to Denmark with his family in 1988. In 1993, he ran for public office and served as an elected member of the Herlev City Council. He served as a lecturer on political economy at the University of Southern Denmark from 2003 to 2004, and as a research fellow at the Institute for Strategy at the Royal Danish Defence College from 2004 to 2006. Ali?
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, and thank you, Heritage, for providing me with this opportunity to share my analysis with you. Ladies and gentlemen, I think there is really a need to thank this institution, because in this town, the only thing that the political level and most political analysts are interested in is the nuclear issue and to some degree the issue of terrorism. But when it comes to human rights in Iran, we do not see the same degree of interest among the political elites of Washington. And this, of course, sends a very interesting political signal to the Iranian public. As long as U.S. lives are at stake, the U.S. is interested in issues. But when human rights violations is targeting the Iranian public, the U.S. doesn't care. That is, of course, sending a very, very wrong signal about the United States and the values it is standing for. I would like to discuss 3 points in the course of the introduction that I have. First of all, I would like to discuss if anything has changed during the presidency of Mr. Rouhani when it comes to human rights. Second, I would like to discuss why it is so difficult for authoritarian, or if you even want, totalitarian regimes to reform themselves when it comes to how they treat their own citizens. And third, I would like to make some very, very modest suggestions concerning how one can actually link the nuclear issue with the issue of human rights inside of Iran. To begin with, Mr. Rouhani. Election of Mr. Rouhani has created a lot of enthusiasm outside of Iran. After all, everybody is comparing Mr. Rouhani with his predecessor. And here you have somebody who seems statesmanlike. He manages to wear a clean shirt, you know, is reasonably well dressed, behaves fairly civilized. And when you take a look at, you know, his predecessor in office, you know, and the bar was set very, very low, you know, during the presidency of Mr. Ahmadinejad. It's quite understandable that everybody here is so excited, you know, but has it translated to any change when it comes to my particular field, the human rights issue? Mr. Rouhani did not campaign for human rights in the course of the presidential campaign in Iran. That was not one of the issues. The main issue that President Rouhani, Mr. Rouhani back then was campaigning for was improving the economic living standards of Iranians. And he was not even proposing reform of Iran's economy. What Mr. Rouhani was proposing back then was that the Islamic Republic of Iran should reach an agreement with the US, get fast access to cash and foreign currency, which then could be distributed among Iranians. In other words, he was not even suggesting that Iran's Soviet-style economy should be changed. The only thing was distribution of cash and some kind of agreement which would give him sanction relief. That was what he promised. His associates were talking back then about some kind of a citizen's charter of rights, which since also has been discussed. And President Rouhani's team, they have made some proposals, and the paper that came out with the same title, in reality talks about the rights of citizens which already exist in Iranian legislation. So according to the constitution, there is freedom of speech in Iran. There is freedom of assembly, there is freedom of religion. But critics of Mr. Rouhani, they correctly point out that, yes, you know, we do have freedom of speech, but we do not have freedom after speech. We do have freedom of assembly, but we do not have freedom after assembly. We do have freedom of religion, but as long as you do not belong to the Baha'i minority, as long as you do not convert to any other religion, you know, from Islam, and as long as you abide by a specific interpretation of Shia Islam. These are the limitations. Now, Mr. Rouhani and his team, they have not been prepared to address any of these issues. They say that, no, we would like to stick with the current legislation. Another issue, which is something that, you know, people have been surprised about, is the fact that Mr. Rouhani, yes, he has purged his cabinet of officers of the Revolutionary Guard. If you make a statistical analysis of the Ahmadinejad cabinets, more than 50% of the cabinet ministers of Mr. Ahmadinejad were former officers of the Revolutionary Guards. Mr. Rouhani has 18 cabinet ministers. Of these 18 cabinet ministers, 4 served their military service in the Revolutionary Guards, which is a low number. And in reality, among the 4, there is only one who is a serious member of the Revolutionary Guards. He is the Minister of Defense, of course. There is a good number of technocrats, so this should be a good sign. Unfortunately, this isn't, because Mr. Rouhani's cabinet also boasts of the largest number of intelligence ministry officials. So in other words, people who have systematically engaged in undermining the human rights of the Iranian public, violating the rights of the Iranian public, have now become cabinet ministers. And increasingly, we also see Mr. Rouhani using those former officials of the intelligence ministry as his apparatniks, trying to counterbalance the Revolutionary Guards. So for Mr. Rouhani, you know, improving the human rights of the Iranian public is not the issue. The issue for him, when it comes to foreign policy, is to get sanction relief. When it comes to the domestic agenda, it is to provide a counterbalance to the power of the Revolutionary Guards. So, what else do we see under Mr. Rouhani? We actually see that number of arrests increases. Mr. Rouhani, he released 80 political prisoners more or less, I think it was 3 or 4 weeks after he was elected president. And of course, New York Times, Washington Post, everybody was so excited that this reformist president of Iran has released all these political prisoners. What they failed to report is that there are still 900 political prisoners in Iran. And the leaders of the opposition, who have been under house arrest since 2009, the fraudulent presidential election, at which time President Mr. Ahmadinejad was re-elected, they are still under house arrest. So the West has a tendency to get happy and excited too fast. That's a problem for us. Why is it such a problem, such a challenge for these type of regimes to moderate themselves when it comes to the way that they behave towards their citizens? Well, unfortunately, the Islamic Republic has learned from Soviet experiences. They know that as soon as the system fails to use systematic terror against citizens as a means and mechanism of maintaining control, there is the risk of the collapse of the regime. You may remember, all of you, back in 1997, Mr. Mohammad Khatami being elected president in Iran. Back then, Mr. Khatami was called in Iran by his critics, he was called Ayatollah Gorbachev. What does it mean? Now, Mr. Gorbachev in the Soviet Union, he did not want to dismantle the Soviet regime. He wanted to reform it. He wanted to give communism a humane face. Now, Mr. Khatami was trying the same thing. What Gorbachev experienced in the Soviet Union was that the reform process that he started completely came out of control. Completely came out of control. Exactly because he was trying to give rights to the public. He was trying to do something about human rights issues. And therefore, the people of the intelligence ministry and also the Revolutionary Guards, but also somebody like Mr. Rouhani, and the former president Rafsanjani, these people, they said that we should not, pursue the same strategy. We should not commit the mistakes of the Soviet regime. So they want a much more controlled process, through which Iran may at some point be able of liberalizing the economy without liberalizing the political system, more or less the Chinese model. Or if you want, Indonesia under Suharto, that type of models. Mr. Rafsanjani, who is the mentor of Mr. Rouhani, and everything Mr. Rouhani says more or less reflects the thinking of Mr. Rafsanjani. They fundamentally believe in economic development minus political development. This is the mindset of these kind of people. And they also fundamentally believe that the state more or less keeping the citizenry in a state of fear and terror is one of the ways of securing survival of the regime at a time of upheaval and social change. So what should the U.S. strategy be? I am modestly proposing that the U.S. of course continues the nuclear negotiations, but tries to couple them with some demands when it comes to human rights. The U.S. has actually a tradition for this kind of creativity when it comes to negotiations. When the American administration during the Cold War were discussing with the Soviets, about arms control, there was also something else called the Helsinki process, through which Soviet citizenry were given some minimum rights, and those minimum rights had a tremendous impact on the thinking of Soviet dissidents, Soviet citizens who no longer felt abandoned by the world community. These are some of the signals that Washington should send in order to mobilize the goodwill reservoir which exists among the Iranian public towards this country. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. And our final speaker is Dr. David Christ. David is a Middle East scholar and a recognized expert on Iran and American foreign policy in the Persian Gulf. He currently serves as a senior historian and advisor for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and a special advisor to the commander of the U.S. Central Command, although it should be said he's speaking on his own today, and on his own behalf. He's a colonel in the Marine Corps Reserves, and he served in the first Gulf War and tours with elite special operation forces in Afghanistan and Iraq, where he saw firsthand the war against Al-Qaeda and the confrontation with Iran. His latest book is The Twilight War, The Secret History of America's 30-year conflict with Iran, which is based on 15 years of research and unparalleled access to senior officials and key documents in several U.S. administrations. And I think this book is one of the most comprehensive assessments of Iranian terrorism yet. David?
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you to Heritage for the invitation. I need to start with my mandatory preamble. As was stated, this talk reflects my own opinion, doesn't reflect that of the Department of Defense, so direct your spears and arrows at me, not at Secretary Hagel, if you don't like what I said. And I agree with Ali. We have sort of fixation on the nuclear issue, but as he mentioned on human rights, there are other issues that really are significant disagreements with Iran. The U.S. government has repeatedly stated that Iran is one of the world's leading state sponsors of terrorism. And terrorism is a tactic and, frankly, just one tool in their kit bag. Iran's real threat to American security interests lies in a broad-based, adaptive, unconventional network that exploits areas of instability as well as traditional Shia population and tribal affiliations. This network uses terrorism along with military assistance, weapons, insurgency or counterinsurgency training, humanitarian assistance, and proselytizing to forward Iran's security interests. Recently, the U.S. military has coined a phrase for this called the Iranian Threat Network, or the ITN. We always have to have an acronym for everything. Not everyone in the U.S. government agrees with this term, because it implies a synchronization, coordination of a ubiquitous force that really doesn't exist as such. But regardless, the output, at least from the Americans' perspective, is largely the same. It allows Iran to exert influence and provides a rapid response capability to attack their enemies in the event of a strike on them. So what comprises the Iranian Threat Network? Most of you know this already, but it's a couple of pieces. There's the Quds Force, which is the covert arm of the Revolutionary Guard, somewhat a cross between the Green Berets and the Peace Corps. Its officers are selected for their ability to operate independently and under broad-based guidance, and they've shown a lot of imagination over the years. Although if you've watched some of the videos coming out of Syria, their tactical competence on the battlefield has left a lot to be desired. There's the MOIS, which is their version of the CIA. It's a traditional intelligence organization, but they have political assassinations as part of their portfolio. And during the 1990s, a lot of the regime opponents who were killed overseas were done by their operatives. And both of these helped the most important arm, Iran's surrogate forces. Iran recruitment of these began in 1981 when they developed a string of terrorist organizations centered on the largely disenfranchised Shia minorities. Iran's intelligence officers operating out of their embassies provided both material support and targeting for these groups' actions. Their greatest success, of course, was forming a conglomerate of Lebanese militias into a cohesive organization, Hezbollah, which remains Iran's most stalwart ally and serves as their key interlocutor with other pro-Iranian Arab groups. And frankly, much in the same way that those of you who remember the Cold War, that Cuba did in Latin America and Central America for the Soviet Union. And frankly, they're Arab, and it helps distance Iran from some of their actions. And frankly, the Iranians, the Revolutionary Guard, has a lot of the same problem the U.S. has, as a lack of Arabic speakers. At the same time, Iran helped form Hezbollah. Tehran nurtured smaller groups within the Persian Gulf area. Some of these were quite small. The Islamic Front for the Liberation of the Arabian Peninsula and Saudi Arabia, the Islamic Front for the Liberation of Oman, were really small groups. Others, the Dawa Party, had branches in Iraq, Kuwait, and Bahrain, which a 1985 CIA estimate numbered in at least 1,000 supporters. And there's even larger groups, the Badr Corps, which is a paramilitary group made up of Shia, primarily Shia defectors from the Iraqi army, numbered in the thousands and based out of Iran. More recently, Iran has cultivated strong ties with Shia militia groups in Iraq, the 17 February group in Bahrain, and of course with Taliban and Palestinian organizations who have really little affinity for Iran but operate under the premise of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Before Syria exploded, the Quds Force commander, Major General Soleimani, that Ali has written extensively about, dispatched some of his most experienced officers as well as weapons to Yemen to expand their support to some friendly tribes there, in hopes that this would be sort of a backdoor to help threaten the Saudi monarchy. And of course, as you all know, Syria has recently consumed a lot of their attention and finances. The Iranian threat network and its asymmetrical capabilities remains Iran's primary offensive arm, and has a track record of being able to conduct widespread attacks across the Middle East. If you take just one example, at a time when Iran really did feel an existential threat from the West, Iraq, and the GCC, in 1981 to 1985, in just those 4 years, Iran attempted a serious coup in Bahrain that nearly succeeded, conduct bombings of American embassy in Lebanon twice, plus blowing up the Marine barracks and the French barracks, conducted a series of bombings across Kuwait, that, including 5 in one day, that targeted economic infrastructure, British and French embassies, and nearly killed the emir himself when a car packed with explosive plowed into his motorcade. 2 hijackings, and not to mention mined the Red Sea surreptitiously with naval mines that completely disrupted economic commerce. Pretty good track record for 4 years. Iran continues to refine its ability to execute these types of attacks and conducts what I think we would call prudent military planning. In other words, they identify potential soft targets that they may be able to use in the event of an attack on their nuclear facilities, for example. And their attack, the bombing of Khobar Towers in 1996, that target had been identified nearly a year earlier as just a possible contingency. And this methodology for them works. This asymmetrical capability that the Iranian threat network provides affords them plausible deniability. It's kind of hard to sometimes to prove who set off a car bomb or laid a mine in the water. It provides them a unique ability to strike back at a much stronger nation while maintaining the outward appearance of affability with the Arab states and frankly lessening the risk of escalation of a conflict with the U.S. And frankly, there has been no cost imposed on Iran for a lot of their covert attacks. The U.S. has consistently failed to respond to these malign actions, from the bombing in Beirut, to Khobar Towers, to mining of international waters, to their Bab-Siar plot, the Cafe Milano plot most recently, to a string of their directed attacks with EFPs and IRAM special munitions against U.S. forces in Iraq. And our response to that was really quite tepid, which amounted to just rolling up some of their operatives. By which time, I think the latest CENTCOM estimate is about 500 American troops died at the hands of these munitions. Tehran does not confine their attacks to the same time and space, which frankly makes it hard to figure out their motives. For example, the bombing of the French barracks in Beirut, which coincided with the Marine barracks, was really done in retaliation for the French providing weapons to the Iraqis in their war with Iran at the time. It took us years to sort of uncover this link, but to Iran it made perfect sense. They're going to assist Saddam Hussein will strike back at a soft French military target. Interestingly, I think Iran sees these asymmetric attacks as proportional, and much of their attacks from their perspective are in response. They're retaliatory to an aggression perceived or real against them. The 2012 attempted assassination of Israeli officials in India and Thailand was done in a method very similar to the way that their own scientists had been assassinated in Tehran. The problem, of course, is what Iran sees as proportional, frequently the U.S. sees as escalatory. And the attempted to kill our Bab-Siar and Cafe Milano in Georgetown a couple of years ago that was exposed, had that succeeded, would have been very escalatory for something that was designed to kill the Saudi ambassador, which we think was in response for their Saudi intervention into the upheavals in Bahrain. Seems completely out of proportion. But be that as it may. So what's the future? Well, I think Iran is focused on the growing sectarian conflict in the region and what is becoming, I think, a covert war with Saudi Arabia. And in this case, the nuclear program doesn't help them much with the security dilemma, but certainly the Iranian threat network does. And if there's increased sanctions relief, if they grow economically, frankly, are taken out of the box of the last 30 years, that provides additional resources for that arm of their offensive capability. And there's a dichotomy to Iranian actions. Efforts at rapprochement have not always correlated with a decrease in their insidious activities. And Iran has frequently sought diplomatic engagement with the U.S. while simultaneously engaging in terrorism and expanding their support for the surrogates. Khobar Towers, which was bombed, an Air Force complex bombed in 1996, was a good example of that. At the same time they bombed it, they were engaged in secret talks in Jeddah with the Saudis about improving relations. And there's a lot of reasons we can talk to you about why sometimes the left and right hand don't seem to know what they're doing. Negotiations for Iran are a tool, but they have neither changed their larger strategic goals nor diminished their utility of their other, again, asymmetrical utensils. I think in some ways this is their version of a talk-fight strategy. And it's presented a challenge for many U.S. administrations as to ascertaining Iranian intentions when their negotiations and malign actions coincide. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to open it up to the floor for questions, but first I'd like to ask one question, and that is, I think too often in Washington, the Iranian government is perceived as kind of the guider of Iranian national interests tonight, but I think what's lost is it's also a revolutionary regime with ideological interests, and ideas have consequences, as conservatives like to say. And one of the enforcers of this ideological, I think, drive in Iran is the Revolutionary Guards, which all three of you have mentioned. And I wonder if you could just say a few words about how the Revolutionary Guards affect the issue in your particular speaking area, like nuclear or ballistic missile, human rights, and terrorism. If you could focus in a little more on the role of the Guards.
Sure, I'll start. My book on the Guard is older than their books on this, so they have more fresh information than I do on this. But, I mean, in terms of the nuclear issue, the Pasdaran, the Revolutionary Guard, have been definitely, at least at the command level, seeking to set limits, set red lines as to what Iran should accept in these talks. You know, they're against the talks from the get-go to start with, but the Supreme Leader has made a decision that these talks are going to happen, and for whatever reason, probably economic, probably political, the Supreme Leader is allowing the negotiation to proceed. And the Guard has staked out a definite position of non-compromise, no dismantling of facilities, no give on Iran's asserted right to enrich uranium. And ballistic missiles, they probably have even more control of. They actually run Iran's ballistic missile force. They govern that. Actually, it's the Revolutionary Guard Air Force that does that. It's not really much of an air force. It's really a ballistic missile force. So they have probably more say over the ballistic missile issue directly. But for now, you know, I think we have to see what is there a deal and what is the deal. And, you know, if Iran is going to agree to give up a lot, then the Rev Guard is going to obviously have something to say about it. In the end, though, I think if the Supreme Leader accedes to whatever is agreed, I think ultimately they would accede to it also, as much as they might distaste it.
Well, you know, I think, you know, one really needs to take a look at the Persian name of this organization. The name of the organization is Sepah Pasdaran Enqilab Islami. What does it mean? It means exactly the army of the guardians of the Islamic Revolution. Iran is not even mentioned in the name of the organization. If you take a logo of the organization, there is a picture of the globe. There is no reference to Iran in the logo either. So in other words, here you have an ideological military organization which sees itself as the vanguard of a global revolution. It is not Iran-centric. It's a global revolution that this institution is the vanguard of. And they also see, also one needs to take a look at the Article 150 of the Constitution of the Islamic Republic, which says that the role of the Revolutionary Guards, the obligation of this institution, is to safeguard the revolution and its achievements. In other words, it is not the territorial integrity of Iran, but it is the ideological foundations of the regime. Whenever they believe that the ideological foundation is threatened, they have the right to intervene, even in domestic politics, to safeguard it. And at the same time, there is the global ambition, and the two reinforce each other. So in other words, in Iran, we had a very early version of the Stalin-Trotsky debate. They were discussing revolution in one country or in several countries. In Iran, the debate was if the revolution was only for Iran or was it a global phenomenon. And the IRGC won the debate because they argued that Islam in Iran and Iran as an Islamic revolutionary state could not survive without trying to export its ideas abroad. Therefore, we are where we are, and this is also why that we see Revolutionary Guards officers criticizing Rouhani's government for giving in the nuclear issue, and also trying at the very same time to subject the Iranian public to in reality to fear, to maintain control.
Clearly, the Revolutionary Guard is certainly one of the key instruments they have for influencing events outside of Iran. They're their chief trainers, advisors, equippers, nurturers of a lot of the pro-Iranian surrogates that are out there. Many of them have spent years in Lebanon, for example, from the foundation of Hezbollah in the early 80s, and have rotated around to a number of areas. The gentleman, a colonel by the name of Shalahi, who was responsible for or at least was the guy who planned, we think, the plot to kill the Saudi ambassador, the Arbab-Siar plot, is really a very experienced guy, having been in Lebanon. He was one of the point men for the Guard in Yemen a few years ago. And so they're quite skilled. They're ideologues. I agree with what Ali said in the sense they see themselves as the vanguard of protecting Islamic interests. They see their mission of not only protecting the larger Shia community, but also providing strategic depth for Iran that they need. At least they believe they need. They can be, I think, if they have one fault, despite their strengths, they also can be very ignorant about how their actions are perceived outside. Again, the Arbab-Siar plot is a good example of that. Had that gone off and killed scores of Americans in a cafe, it would have been pretty dramatic. So the fact that they even contemplated that is a little disturbing, I guess. The regular Revolutionary Guard supports them to a degree, although the Quds Force is really their own arm. They report, General Soleimani reports directly to the Supreme Leader, not through the Revolutionary Guard chain. We've seen increasing roles of the regular Revolutionary Guard in Syria, in part because the commitment is so strong. It exceeds the Quds Force's ability to do, particularly on training and advising issues. And I think you would see an acceleration of that if Iraq really fell apart and Iran needed to come to the aid of the Shia there.
And now I'd like to open it up to the audience for questions. I would just ask that you indeed ask a question and not make an extended statement, and that you wait till the microphones come to you. Let me start with this woman here.
Yeah, I was hearing a lot of talk about the U.S. demanding human rights, and things mentioned is proselytizing, providing weapons, and religion. I never hear anyone criticize Saudi Arabia for the same things. I know that in Iran, being a Baha'i, it's not allowed, but you can be a Christian, you can be a Jew. It's actually the second largest Jewish population in the Middle East. Try being a Christian in Saudi Arabia. Proselytizing makes me think of Wahhabism, which is what Al-Qaeda, I think, is also. They're Sunni extremists. And as for the weapons, there's been a lot of reports that the Saudis have been supplying the other side in Syria. which is rife with Al-Qaeda, and ironically, my government seems to want to support these people as well. Meanwhile, we're fighting them in other parts of the Middle East. And the other question I was going to ask about the whole nuclear issue, if Iran actually did get a nuclear weapon, does anyone here honestly think that they would ever strike the U.S. with that, because they would be obliterated off the planet? And another idea would be is if they would agree to not get nuclear weapons, if we also made Israel get rid of their nuclear stockpile, and then have no one in the Middle East with a nuclear weapon.
Okay, let me just hit the first question. We have had panels here criticizing Saudi human rights, especially lack of freedom of religion. And, you know, we'll have many panels in the future. When it comes to Iranian nuclear weapon, I don't know, I would have been, I wouldn't be surprised if they thought they could get away with it, if they were, in their minds, provoked by some kind of U.S. policy, then perhaps they would try that. I think a regime that would plan bombing a restaurant in Georgetown to respond to a Saudi policy in Bahrain, you know, I wouldn't rule out too much with that thing. But let me just open it up to the panel with the question of.
Let me just take the nuclear for the issue is not whether they would detonate a nuclear weapon against the United States. The issue is how would their foreign policy, which particularly Dr. Christ delineated, where they're basically working against U.S. interests in all these areas, how would that be affected if they had a nuclear weapon, where they could then take more risks to advance their agenda in the belief that we could not retaliate or in any way pressure them because they had a nuclear weapon. That's the issue. It's not a question of would they fire a nuke, even at Israel. I don't think anybody really believes they would actually fire a nuclear weapon at Israel. The issue is their foreign policy would be enhanced in ways that are detrimental to the U.S. interests.
Yes, well, yes, the lady in the front is right. The religious minorities, the Jewish community in Iran, I think is one of the things that we Iranians can rightly be proud of. Iran truly boasts of the second largest Jewish community in the Middle East, next after Israel. But it does not say much about the regime in Tehran. It says something about the tolerant nature of the Iranian society and us Iranians. Iranians never distinguish who is Jewish, who is Shia, who is Sunni. No, the Iranian society is actually tolerant enough so that Iranian Jews, first and foremost, they consider themselves Iranians and then as Jews. That, I think, is a credit to the Iranian society, not so much to the regime. Concerning Christians, I think the U.S. government should worry about the matter of conversion. People who, because of the wrongdoings of the regime, of the Islamic Republic of Iran, which has been in power for the past 35 years, and has been such a terrible fiasco, choose to abandon Islam and convert to another religion, be it Zoroastrianism, be it Christianity, or any other faith, Baha'i faith also. These people are subjected to persecution, and that, of course, is something that the U.S. government should be concerned about.
I would just say certainly the question, certainly the Saudis are concerned that there may be a long-term convergence of interest between the U.S. and Iran over Sunni extremism, and there may be an area of cooperation on that front, which exceeds the scope of what I was asked to talk about. You know, I think the big concern with the nuclear issue is exactly what was said by the other panelists, is that it provides them sort of an umbrella. It frankly guarantees the security of the regime, and the Iranians are acutely aware that the U.S. has not attacked another country with nuclear weapons. So it's the question of what does that embolden other aspects of their foreign policy that the U.S. finds objectionable, and that, to me, is the concern.
You have another question here? Oh, yes, sir.
Yeah, for Ali, about human rights in Iran. What do you make of Rouhani and Zarif's use of Twitter? That seems to be pretty much against the Chinese model of state-controlled social media. It's a banned website in Iran, so do you agree?
Well, to the credit of the government of China, they abandoned Twitter, and the leaders of China do not use Twitter in order to send messages to the West. The Iranian leaders do not have such strong principles and excel in hypocrisy. They ban use of Twitter for Iranians, but themselves communicate messages to the world through Twitter. So I think I respect the government of China in this case.
That's a challenge to the status quo, though. Only Iranians are now using it, and even reached out to Israel.
I certainly think that if the regime tries to open up, and this is a very big if, we are not seeing that happening. Yes, social media are going to challenge the stability of the regime. This is also why that I do not anticipate liberalization of those things. A large number of those 900 people who are political prisoners in Iran, they are bloggers who were actually using Facebook and Twitter through proxy networks in order to communicate messages to the Iranian public in order to have a free debate, which was perceived as a threat, and those people were rounded up and arrested by the Revolutionary Guard's intelligence unit. We see hypocrisy, not so much liberalization right now.
We have another question here. Oh, yes, sir, over here.
Yes, first of all, I thoroughly enjoyed the discussion, especially the comments by Mr. Alfone about the hypocrisy of the Iranian regime in every respect. And just add to that, you mentioned bloggers being arrested by the Iranian intelligence. All of us remember Sattar Beheshti, who was a blogger who ended up being killed under torture. And to the human rights issue that you raised, I would add 190 executions since 2014 and 682 in 2013, two-thirds of which were under Rouhani's presidency, which speaks a lot about the nature of who Rouhani is and what he represents. The question I have, though, is obviously you raised a series of very important issues in dealing with Iran, the lack of attention to the human rights issue, the lack of attention to Iran's support for terrorism around the world. But I think that these are all, in some respects, a piecemeal approach to the Iranian problem. One thing that I see absent in all of the debate about Iran is the role of the opposition and the Iranian people themselves, if you will. And I think we're too much focused on the dichotomy between either bombing Iran or letting Iran have the bomb. In your view, why should the United States try to reach out to the Iranian opposition? And by that I mean in general, not one specific opposition. You talked about the nuclear sanctions regime. Well, that was triggered by the Iranian opposition, by its revelations. You talk about the U.S. concern for Iranian terrorism. You know that the Iranian opposition was very helpful to the U.S. military in Iraq when the U.S. was in Iraq, and of course they provided actionable intelligence to the U.S. military. So in your view, what do you think the United States should do really to try to devise a comprehensive strategy to deal with the threat of Iran? Because frankly, myself being Iranian, I do not believe that anything short of a regime change would deal with the crisis that we are facing, both in terms of the nuclear issue, the human rights issue, and the terrorism issue. And I'd like to hear from the panelists on this.
Okay, we would like to...
What's the start?
Well, I think at least on the opposition piece, I think there's some you can do. I mean, certainly the Iranian government's acutely concerned about the soft power influence, the corrupting influence of Western culture, which, having watched the last couple of Grammy Awards, I may be with the Supreme Leader on that one. But but I mean, the opposition, you know, we've looked, and not to plug my book, but I outlined a lot of earlier efforts to support an opposition movement in Iran. And frankly, we haven't really come up with I don't think an internal revolt against Iran, a regime change, is really a realistic possibility. I think what needs to happen with Iran is not something dramatic, but is an evolutionary change within the government, which will happen, I think, primarily once this revolutionary generation is gone, and sort of the natural course of events takes over. I just think the supporting an opposition movement, which we've looked at before, I just don't see. I see sympathetic views amongst a lot of the Iranian populations to the West. It doesn't necessarily translate in fermenting a revolt that would actually overthrow the regime.
Well, one of the I think one of the preconditions of democracy is a free debate, just like the one we are having here. And because of the fact that the regime in Tehran is denying the Iranian public the fora and opportunity to engage in a free debate and fora for free exchange of ideas, one of the things that the U.S. government could do was actually to improve its outreach to the Iranian television and radio audience, but also internet users. At some point, the regime in Tehran really needs to make a very hard choice, either to go the path of North Korea or actually allow some degree of information, getting into the country. And for now, they seem to opt for the second option. But that has not been translated to providing fora for debate. So why, one of the ways that the Iranian opposition could actually be supported is by having a means of reaching out to the Iranian public and by discussing among themselves. There is not one Iranian opposition. There are many different groups. There are many different viewpoints. And these political ideas need to mature. We Iranians need to learn democracy, by practicing it. And I think the U.S. government could actually promote it. And I would love to see the regime in Tehran argue its opposition, on what grounds it's opposed to U.S. government more or less providing surrogate media and fora for debate for the Iranian audience.
Another question? Well, at this point, I'd just like to thank our panel for a very lucid presentation, and join me in thanking you. And we have some sandwiches outside.